I see Jose just joined. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this discussion. It's part of Baltimore Data Week. My name is Evan Serpick. I'm the Director of Communications at OSI-Baltimore. And we're really excited to talk about a project that those of us on the panel worked on together called Blueprint to Baltimore, and sort of how it was sort of an attempt to work with community to generate data about community priorities, and then sort of a look at how that data can be used to sort of implement policy changes. So we'll have a really great panel. We'll take a minute, I guess, in a second to have everyone introduce themselves and their organizations. Maybe we can just go over the agenda real quick on the next slide. There we go. So yeah, we'll just go through our organizations. OSI, Organizing Black, and HR&A, and then also BNIA, which is not only our host today, but also was really involved in this project in taking the data and creating a data portal on its website that really looks great. I think they're going to do a demonstration about it later. That's later on in the agenda. And then next I'll give a little overview of the Blueprint for Baltimore, HR&A, and Organizing Black. We'll talk about sort of their roles, which were both key roles and also very different roles from an outsider and then a really community-based perspective. We'll talk about our takeaways and how this can be used, both this project and for other projects in the future, and then we'll take questions. Folks can put questions in the chat and we'll pick them up and circulate them, or if you're on Facebook, you can post them there and someone's there to grab them and push them to us. So yeah, let's start with introductions. As I said, my name is Evan Serpick from OSI Baltimore. If folks are not familiar, you can go to the next slide, just as a quick introduction. We're part of an international organization called Open Society Foundations, which does work, I don't even remember how many countries, more than 80 countries around the world. We're actually the only, Baltimore office is the only US-based field office. They have field offices in every continent. And until about 20 years ago, didn't do work in the US because, open society in the US was thought to be pretty open. Well, we know now that there are actually a lot of threats to open society here. So we started working in Baltimore about 22 years ago with the idea that lessons we learn here about working with communities can be used around the country. So we primarily focused traditionally on criminal and juvenile justice, education and youth development, and addiction and health equity. We also have a fellowships program. A lot of the most incredible, passionate activists and advocates in Baltimore are community fellows, and we're really proud of that. We also have a more broad sort of vision to work with community-based organizations in Baltimore, and that's really where the Blueprint work came from. So I can get into that in a minute, but that's sort of a general idea where we come from. And I think Organizing Black is next. Trey, do you want to give a little overview?
Yes, hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Trey Murphy. I am the co-founder and the Director of Strategies and Program for a grassroots organization known as Organizing Black. We are essentially a grassroots membership-led organization dedicated to fighting for the liberation of all Black people. And we do that through a couple of avenues. So the first avenue is through direct action. We are direct action practitioners. We believe that in order to change the world that we currently exist in, to make it something that is equitable, that is meaningful, that works for everyone, that we have to ultimately use our bodies and use our personal resources in order to do that. And so we do that through direct action, which is just a pretty way of saying that we do marches, we do rallies, we do campaigns, we do civil disobedience, we do a spectrum of things around direct action. We also do our work through participatory governance. So we do believe that democratic processes can inherently be made better. And one of the fundamental flaws that we view in the US sort of colonialism, Westernization of thinking around democracy is that it's not participatory enough. So even beyond just voting for representatives, we also believe that the people who are most directly affected by an issue should also be on the forefront of addressing that issue. So we believe in participatory and shared governance practices sort of as a foundational core value of ours. And then we also believe in capacity building. So we don't believe that it's enough for us to tell somebody else's story. We also have to build the leaders to be able to tell their own stories, right? Again, going back to the people who are most directly impacted by an issue should be on the forefront of it. So we host trainings, we host political education, we do a wide spectrum of things to ensure that we're building the capacity of our community so that we can have strong communities as a foundational principle. So that is Organizing Black.
Thanks, Trey. We have Jose and Eri from HR&A.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, Evan and BNIA, for having us be a part of this and to be invited to be part of Blueprint for Baltimore. My name is Jose Serrano-McClain. I am a director with HR&A Advisors. HR&A Advisors is an employee-owned, mission-driven advisory firm. We work with cities around the country on urban policy, on urban planning issues. We work to improve how cities work for people. That means the firm has been around for 40 years. In the last 10 years, there has been a market shift to take the things that we have learned as an institution over those 4 decades, knowing how city governments think about making cities better and the sort of tools of economic development and the tools of policy. And we've made a real investment in taking the sort of means of economic development and urban policy to enable communities to change, to basically learn that game and to change outcomes. We really understand that you can't have a conversation about equity if you're not engaging and designing with the folks that are impacted, including folks of color, undocumented communities. We have, over the last several years, have really taken an interest in understanding how to take community voice and translating it into the language of government. We know that governments now are really taking are investing in this idea that that good government is data-driven. So we've invested ourselves in thinking about sort of interrogating that, asking, so who produces that data that leads to the decision-making that happens at the administrative level, at the legislative level, in like things like city council. So who produces that data and what data is being used to essentially guide big picture decision-making. We've been involved ourselves in all kinds of strategic plans. You see here on the slide that the city of New York did a big strategic plan for its next 50 years. All of those kinds of documents are things that lay out a kind of vision for city government. But we've started to become very, very curious and invested in projects that bring community data into those strategic planning processes. So we know the language of government. In Portland, for example, we worked really closely with the budgeting department for the city of Portland to do a large-scale survey of Portlanders, and it was one of the foundations that we brought to the work here for the blueprint. We'll tell you a little bit more about our role in that, but suffice it to say that in Portland, we invested in this idea that community voice needs to be part of the budgeting process, and working directly with the budget office in Portland to make sure that our survey was really about enabling their vision for racial equity in budget decision making in that city. So we bring some of those kinds of some of that orientation to this work, and excited to get more into it as we go deeper into the presentation.
Great, thanks, Trey and Jose. I think we should say at the top that the five of us sort of on this panel are really a fraction of the people who made this Blueprint project happen. They were, Organizing Black was one of 5 community organizations that were partners, which I think they're on a slide, but just to throw it out there, I think it was CASA, Baltimore Votes, Black Girls Vote, Organizing Black, and No Boundaries Coalition. So that was really the core team that made this happen, with with a lot of advisors from people who gave us advice, from Stephanie Smith from the Department of Planning, Dr. Lawrence Brown. Like, I could list lots and lots of people who we all talked to through this. So this was really a sort of a citywide effort. So I just want to make sure that it's clear up top. So just to give a little bit of background before we sort of hear from everybody, the Blueprint for Baltimore project started, from our perspective at OSI, with a project we did 4 years ago called Solutions Summit before the 2016 election, which was kind of an attempt to lift up the issues that communities were focused on before that election, to sort of make sure that the things that people wanted to be talked about in the run-up to the election were talked about. And so we held a series of community forums to sort of draw out those priorities. And then we sort of culminated in a big event at the War Memorial, which had like 700 people. This is back in December 2016, where we sort of presented those priorities to the new mayor, which was Pugh. And she actually gave a speech where she responded to it. It was a good exchange, frankly. It was honestly the most substantive policy discussion I think she gave, ever. It was a 45-minute presentation. And it was directly responsive to these things which came from the community, which was great. But really, when we looked into 2020, we wanted to think about doing something that was more data-oriented, because while those community meetings were really powerful and it was great to hear voices of people, it was mostly anecdotal. And so we thought, let's see if we can do something a little bit more quantitative, as opposed to qualitative. So we actually reached out to HR&A initially, because I should say that even the Solution Summit, part of the inspiration for that was work that HR&A did in New York and Washington, D.C. with Open Society to hold Talking Transition, which was sort of projects to lift up community voices into the mayoral transition team. So Jose or Eri might talk about that later, but that was sort of the initial inspiration. So coming into the 2020, we said, let's do a real survey, a citywide survey. And our priorities really coming into it were that we wanted to make sure the voices of community members who often are not represented were included here. So traditional surveys, are phone oriented, they're online. They tend to miss broad swaths of the population. So we really wanted to make sure to partner with community-based organizations that were rooted in the city and in populations, that are outside the White L. So, we identified those community partners and really let them sort of take the lead in how the survey happened. And they each recruited 10 data fellows who went out and talked to people. I mean, it was mostly, the survey was more than 50% canvassed. So people either going door to door or going to community events, going, to Lexington Market or laundromats or wherever the people were, the data fellows sort of went and got some really fantastic data. So that's sort of the overview where it came from. And then from that, we had a big mayoral forum on February 5th, where we released the data in January this year in a report that's online. I think the link is somewhere, but it's OSIBaltimore.org/blueprint. Pretty much everything related to the blueprint is at that URL, OSIBaltimore.org/blueprint. So the report is there. And then we had this mayoral forum on February 5th, which was really powerful. I mean, it was a lot of candidates, so it's hard to sort of have as substantive a conversation as I think we wanted to, but really good conversations that were rooted in data that people, we could say, 45% of the people who we surveyed said they don't want more police. They want, community-based anti-violence programming. How are you gonna do that? Just those kinds of questions that were rooted in community priorities. Then we had plans for another city council forum and another mayoral forum that got disrupted by COVID. So we actually shifted in ways that I think worked out pretty well. We did one-on-one interviews with the 6 primary city council candidates that were interviewed by Lisa Snowden-McCrae from the Real News Network and Baltimore Beat, Kalila Harris from Center for American Progress, and also just a huge education advocate in Baltimore. A lot of folks know her. And so those were good. And then for the 3rd mayoral forum, we partnered with the Stoop Storytelling series, and they worked with candidates to tell stories, from their actual stoops. It was the first time they were able to actually be on stoops, considering that they were remote. So that was sort of our the span of the project in a nutshell. Now is sort of an exciting next phase of the project where we look at this data. And I know we've had conversations, with some of our partner organizations, community organizations, about how they are going to leverage the data to actually make policy change and to create campaigns around some of those issues. And we also have interesting conversations about how to have further public information events and projects to let people know what people in communities care about. So that was sort of my overview. Let's see what's next on the next slide. So yeah, these were sort of the goals coming out there. Be inclusive of diversity of Baltimoreans. Like I said, sort of this was not your typical phone or internet survey. We wanted to represent real Baltimoreans. And frankly, you see that in the results. The results were different than you get in a phone survey. They were much more representative of people in a diverse range of communities. We wanted to lead to actionable results. That's something I think Trey and Jose can speak to later, that when we designed the survey design workshops, it was really key that the questions would lead to answers that could be actionable. So we talked a lot about the budget, for example, which is a lever that the city controls. There's all kinds of levers that the city doesn't control, but we were really focused on what can we put to our city council candidates or mayoral candidates to say, this is what people want you to do, and it's very clear. So actionable results, transformative change. I think we wanted to make sure we talked about the big issues. We did the 6 categories. See if I think we'll go through them later, but they were public safety, health, housing, civic engagement, 2 other ones, but they were just really big issues that we knew people cared about. And then finally, to hold government accountable. So that was sort of the public events and sort of the post-survey engagement we talked about. And I think I sort of went over these things. These are the organizations we worked with, 5 organizations. More than 5,000 Baltimoreans responded, which was just about 1% of the city population, which is kind of incredible for a mostly in-person survey. It's the largest issue-oriented survey in city history. 44% of the people who participated did not vote, which I think is something that we certainly at OSI want to think about and talk about when we talk about civic engagement. That why are people so disenfranchised that they're not motivated to vote, while they certainly care enough to be able to talk about their city and the things they care about? Why aren't they motivated to do that? And what can we do to make them feel connected enough to public officials that there's a reason for them to vote? The survey was offered in 4 languages. I don't know the percentage offhand, but a significant number were from Spanish-speaking residents. Thanks a lot to CASA and their focus on immigrant communities. Next slide. And so this is just an example of one of the media stories. We actually got a really good, Christina Zhang, who unfortunately left the Sun, was a great data reporter. She works for the Financial Times now. She's sort of leading up there. I saw Jose's response, but I feel you, because she was a great data reporter who wrote a couple of really in-depth stories about the survey, and it was covered elsewhere too. And I think now I'm gonna maybe turn it over to, I don't know if it's Jose or Trey, maybe Jose, who's more comfortable talking about the process.
I can take this on, and Jose and Trey can jump in. Cool. Hi all, my name is Eri Furusawa. I'm also with Jose at HR&A. And Evan, thanks for the intro. We just wanted to lay this out for folks who are interested in how this process actually went, and making sure that this process and how long things took and what the process in each step was like was transparent to you all. So this is something we took about 6 months from when this kicked off in August of last year to when the report was completed. And then from there, OSI, as Evan mentioned, led a number of public engagement and mayoral forums after the report was launched. So just to go over each of the steps in what the survey entailed was that, so once we kicked off, we were on the ground and we met Trey and others who served as community partners on this project. We designed the survey, which took about 6 weeks, and then which included a series of survey design workshops, which Trey and Jose will get into more later. And this was something that was really also exciting to us at HR&A, because even though we've done a series of projects where we really focused on inclusive community engagement, designing the survey questions and really asking people what they wanted to be asked through this survey was a critical moment and what really made this different from everything else. And so we're really excited to talk more about how this workshops went. And then so that was part of the survey design. We also had a data fellow training where we got everybody who were going to be doing the canvassing in one room over a day-long training where we had folks come in from the data science community to really talk about what this meant and what it meant for the community to have data, what it meant for the community to produce data and own it and use it for advocating. And then also aligning all the fellows with support from Trey and others on the mission of this project and just breaking down the canvassing 101 piece and really practicing what would be most effective for canvassers to go out and on the ground and get responses. And then from there, we launched the survey and it went live the latter half of October. We left it open for about 8 months, where Trey and others on the team were really on the ground every day, collecting the data from Baltimoreans. So that's the canvassing piece that you see here. And then throughout all that, we made sure to check in on the data as they were coming in so that we were making sure, are there any skews in representation? Are we getting more neighborhoods, more than others? So that's why you see the data analysis piece taking place even as the data was still being collected. And then once we closed the survey in early December, we took about a month for the data analysis piece, looking at the data that we collected and then having another workshop with Trey and community partners to understand what are the best pieces of analyses that we can extract from this data. So overall, this was about 9-month effort overall from kickoff to where it was in April, and we're happy to take more questions in the following after this presentation. If you go to the next slide, please. So just a sneak peek into what the survey, what questions were included in the survey, we were basically structuring this in 3 pieces. The first is very simple and just making sure that we were asking folks who lived in Baltimore City. And then from there, we asked 7 questions on demographics and the level of civic engagement. So you see the examples on the slide, just asking which neighborhood do you live in? And this is a whole data story that I can talk into more later, but we really wanted to make sure that we were getting which neighborhoods were responding more so that we could map where responses were coming from. And also, of course, asking people what the race, how they identified racially and ethnically to make sure that we were getting a representative sample from Baltimore residents. And then lastly, we asked 22 questions on the specific issues. So you'll see an example here where we talked about, this is how much the operating budget of the city is. This is how much the mayor has power over. So to Evan's point on levers and what's actually controllable for the city. So after providing that information, we asked, well, based on what you believe Baltimore needs, which of these options do you think the city should prioritize most? And just to reiterate Evan's point, we really wanted to make sure the questions were targeted on the levers and the things that the city had control over. So this is why half of our questions on specific issues deal with how the city should spend money. And where possible, we also try to accompany the question piece with accompanying information about how the city works. So you'll see that we've included how big the city's operating budget is, and then how much the mayor has control over. And we try to kind of sprinkle that in wherever possible. You'll see that in another question on the consent decree, but we really wanted to take this opportunity to make this an educational experience for the survey takers, so that we weren't just, asking and extracting information from people. We wanted to make sure that the people who interfaced with the survey were getting things out of this survey as they were responding. So we have a quick poll for the people dialing in. So you'll see that this was actually one of the survey questions that we included in the Blueprint for Baltimore survey. And if folks could take a look and answer, these are the options that were actually used in the survey as well. And we'll take maybe a minute.
It'll be interesting to see how this crowd compares to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the post. It's a post poll now.
Is that?
So people are responding to, I think, this moment that we're in right now, which is interesting. May have been different than what people responded to 6 months ago.
Interesting. So can people see those results now, or?
Yep.
Okay, great. That's interesting. I think I don't know if it's the next slide or later on, but we have how this was answered in the poll numbers. I guess it's not here, but I think it's later in the presentation. I think youth programs finished #1. But here it looks like investment in small business and neighborhood development. It's very interesting. Okay.
I think they're responding to literally what we're seeing right around us.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
And things like that.
Yeah. Okay, should we go to the key takeaways? So, yeah, this is honestly could be a whole separate presentation, but so I encourage folks to after this presentation is over, go to the actual Blueprint survey, and you'll see later how to use the portal to look up different responses. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm not sure who's taking this one. Oh, Eric, Jose?
Well, I'll make an introduction of what we wanted to share with you all today. Really in the spirit of making this a practice that a tool and a practice that communities can avail themselves of to tell their own stories, to shape their own communities, to change the systems that shape their lives. The spirit that we're sort of bringing to this is let's get into some of the things that surprised us, some of the things that we learned in the process, in order for you all to.
Eri, you went. Jose, I can't hear you. Can anybody hear Jose?
Jose, I think you're muted.
I think we lost it. I think he can't hear us either.
All right, well, I'll sort of jump in, and then hopefully Jose can jump back in. So hello, everybody. So, as Jose was saying, in the spirit of the process, we wanted to make sure that this process was community led and community run, and had the buy-in of the community from the front end to the back end. And so even the sort of structure of the process was based on 4 different levels. So first, we had the survey design and data fellow training. And then we had the data collection piece. The third piece was the data analysis piece. And then the 4th piece was how we use the data. And we're going to, in the next slide, we're going to go into each one of these in greater detail. But really quickly, Jose, did we get your sound back?
Yeah, I'm back, y'all. Thank you. I was going on and on about the people, yeah, anyway, go ahead, Trey.
And feel free to jump into Jose if I leave anything out. But so the survey design, can we go to the, okay, we are on the next slide. Great. No, we're on the next slide. All right. So the survey design and data fellow training. So the first step the way in which we designed this phase, which was really the initial phase after we decided that we wanted to do this, right? So, we collectively all decided that we need data. We need to know what our citizens, what community members, what Baltimoreans think and feel about city government, city infrastructure, the budget, their neighborhoods, etc. And so the next layer inside of it was that when the community partners was selected, as Evan mentioned, we talked about making this a tiered process from the beginning, right? So the first tier of the process was for us to have survey design workshops, right? Now, these survey design workshops were structured in a way for us to get feedback about what Baltimore residents felt like were the issues, right? So even before we developed the questions, we was like, we need a clear analysis on what the issues are as Baltimore residents see it, so that we can then begin to develop the questions, right? So we hosted, I think, 5 community survey design workshops, Evan, if I'm not mistaken. And inside of each one of those 5 community survey design workshops, we asked people point blank, what are the issues? We explained to them what we were trying to do. We asked them if it would be useful, and we asked them to rank their issues from top to bottom. And I think we took maybe the top 3 of each survey design workshop. From that point forward, after we identified the issues, the second stage was to develop the questions. And I'm going to pause here to talk about the development of the questions, because there was one key piece that I left out in the beginning, which was that before we even got to the community survey design workshops, we had made a conscious decision as a group that although this was a project of Open Society Foundation, and Open Society Institute Baltimore in particular, that the community organizations who would have to be accountable to everyday residents, everyday citizens, everyday community members, they would actually be the ones that would have these sort of final decision-making power over the process, and particularly over the questions that was asked. And this was really a checks and balances system, so that if the community, if we had the authority as community partners to speak on behalf of the community would have the authority to hold us accountable. And that means that we had an additive level and additive invested interest to make sure that the questions that was asked of them was questions that was going to be beneficial for creating some sustainable and substantive changes. So that was part of how we got to the survey design workshops, was because we recognized that we had to listen to the community.
Right, and I'd just like to add one thing, because in a way, it was also a check on, these consultants over here that came in to support the process. But the truth is that even with all of the experience that we bring in planning surveys and in executing surveys, the point was that HR&A was positioned as a support entity to the community partners, with using the funding of OSI-Baltimore, but really we had to be responsive to the coalition of community partners and really sort of act as in an advisory capacity. And I say that because many of you in community work are going to encounter the opportunity to be supported or work with folks that are in the consulting game. And I think this is a really important opportunity to sort of make sure that the governance and the decision-making isn't cloudy. Like, those who are accountable to community need to be the ones at the decision-making table. And y'all can't let consultants get too deep into the decision-making. That's just like a little bit of advice that I bring as someone who is in that, in that position.
No, thank you for that, Jose, because, that is super critical and important, especially, again, as we talk about organizing Black foundational principle around the people who are most directly impacted by a problem, and who are the closest to the issue, being the ones that are on the forefront of any solution or any sort of campaign or avenue to address those issues. So that was the first process, or the first part was the survey design. Oh, we're still on the first slide. Sorry, still on that slide. Yep. So that was the first sort of piece. The second piece was for us to do the development of the questions. And this was a piece where we had a lot of back and forth, right? And so the consultants sort of took on the burden of drafting the questions based on what the community had identified as the issue areas or focuses. And then those questions came to the community partner for approval. And then that was the third step in that process, was the feedback and approval of sort of the community partners. And the way in which we did the feedback and approval in the spirit of trying to make sure that this was truly community owned was that we actually had shopped around the questions to other organizations and entities that were not officially a part of this project, right? And so we got the feedback from organizations who specialize in particular areas like education, like criminal justice, like housing, and said, if we ask this question of thousands of Baltimore residents and we got this data, would it be useful for your campaign, right? Would it be useful for your work? And we wanted to make sure, again, that this information was actionable. So that was sort of the first piece, was that design workshop. And I'll briefly just go through the other pieces. The second piece was inside of this one bucket. The second piece was making sure that we had skilled community fellows who were equipped to actually administer the survey itself, right? And so that meant that we hosted a canvassing training with all of the partner organizations and all of their fellows so that we can share best practices, tips learned. One of the things that I will flag for anybody, especially, this may be my over a decade worth of grassroots organizing coming in, but it's always a hit or miss when we talk about canvassing and fellows, in part because of the way these things are structured, right? And so this is, I guess, an important plug for me, and I'll talk about this in greater detail in the next slide. But an important thing for folks to keep in mind is that if we want people to be able to deploy skill sets to collect data, we have to equip them with those skill sets and train them up, right? And so as a foundational practice, what we did was we hosted all of the organizations and their fellows together. We had a panel on the importance of data so that they could have buy-in from the forefront, from the fellows themselves, so that they could give feedback on the actual questions. Although at that time they was almost set, but there was sort of some wiggle room, and we had got some great feedback from the fellows in which we quickly incorporated into a few questions so that we could make sure that the questions were actionable and they were done in a way in which that those fellows could actually administer the survey. So we hosted that canvassing training, which was also a skill set, but also a space for us to learn how we could better improve the survey itself. And then the last thing was that we used the survey itself to raise awareness. So, and we'll talk about the data collection phase in a second, but we, as Jose mentioned, and as I believe Evan mentioned as well, we wanted to make sure that when we asked questions, we were also given information as well, right? So we didn't just ask, how did you want your money spent when it came to the city budget? We also said, did you know that the mayor controls $1 billion out of the $3 billion? There's some money that is set, but there's this other pot of money that is wiggle room money that is actually your taxpayer dollars. And you can actually tell the mayor, don't invest inside of this entity, invest inside of this entity. So we wanted to make sure that that was a central piece of the survey as well, that building that political awareness around policy issues.
I just want to jump in. We're running short on time, so we can run through the next one pretty quickly, if you don't mind. We have some really good questions we want to get to.
Yes, okay. So let me just run through. And actually, I'm going to start off, and then I'm going to kick it to Jose, and sort of you can explain it in a little bit more concise version. So the second piece was the data collection piece. And so in the data collection piece, one of the things that I just want to highlight around creative approaches to collecting data, we had talked about a bunch of creative approaches, including being in places where people congregate, such as barbershops and hair salons, being at malls, being at events, We had people at parties, and we even began to collect data towards the end at mass actions and rallies, right? So wanted to just put that plug in there around thinking about creative ways to collect data. And on Organizing Black side, we actually used this project as a part of a larger campaign strategy for us. So we had a campaign around defunding the police, defunding Baltimore City Police Department before the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests had arisen. And we also had a campaign around lowering the voting age. And so we was able, the fellows that we had selected was fellows that had already gone through our cohorts, from which we did a cohort of about 30 folks, where we gave them political education and we was teaching them how to be organizers, how to be campaign strategists, how to deploy and develop those skill sets for broader systemic change. And this project allowed us to give those fellows actual hands-on experience with trying out these organizing tactics. So that'll be the only thing that I highlight, and I'm gonna pass it to Jose.
Yeah, the only thing I should say here or reiterate, which I think Eri mentioned a bit ago, is that so we provide, so the canvassers were doing both paper surveys and using mobile phones, since the survey was also available digitally, and we had each of our canvassing teams had their own sort of version of their own sort of like we could track what teams were hitting what geographies because of the mobile phones, in a way that really helped us understand what neighborhoods we were not getting enough responses from and what neighborhoods we were actually we had sufficiently sort of covered in terms of a response rate where we can credibly say we have reached sufficient folks here to be able to make some conclusions about how the folks in this geography sort of feel about the given questions. So that sort of real-time monitoring was enabled by the fact that the survey was done digitally, but we were also using paper surveys because in some cases that was what the sort of context called for. Importantly, though, we were making sure that the leads of each of the canvassing crews were uploading those surveys as quickly as possible, those paper surveys, so that we can kind of make sure that the database was as real time as possible. So let's move on to the next slide really quickly.
All right, so I'll go through what the best lessons learned as we wrapped the survey and got into really data crunching mode. And we have 3 key takeaways to share. One is that once you have the data, quantity is important, but also make sure that it's representative of who you're trying to reach. So in our case, one of our community partners called CASA did a fantastic job of reaching so many Latinx populations within Baltimore. I think they got about 4% of all the Latinx populations in Baltimore. But what that did also was that provided a robust sample of that population, but it also ended up making our data for the blueprint process a little bit skewed towards the Latinx population. We wanted to make sure that we were weighting, whenever we were looking at citywide averages, we were making sure that we were correcting for those increases and decreases based on the race and ethnicity, so that when anything that we were quoting as an average for the city was representative of Baltimore's actual demographic representation. Another lessons we learned is that the importance of just breaking down the data by race or age, or sometimes race and age, and we'll have an example of that later, but not just looking at citywide averages, but making sure that you're capturing the differences between each of the subgroups that you're looking into. And lastly, we made sure to compare across multiple questions. So making sure that comparing between people who answered X for a question, how do they answer differently compared to others for a different question? So if you go to the next slide, I have an example of the farmer. Great, thank you. So this is an example where we actually learned a lot from Trey and his team on the importance of looking at not just at race, but at age and race. This was a question about whether respondents knew about the consent decree. And then you'll see that we've broken down the groups into Black, white, and Latinx, and also by age group within each of those groups. And you see that there's a few very interesting takeaways that you wouldn't have seen if we hadn't looked at age also. You can see that, for example, for both Black and white respondents, they're more likely to know about the consent decree if they're older. But even given that, if you compare across different age groups, white respondents are more likely to know about the consent decree than Black respondents for every single age group. And if you look at Latinx respondents, you see that the likelihood of knowing about the consent decree doesn't really increase with age, which we thought was a really interesting finding. And also for every age group, they're less likely to know about the consent decree compared to white respondents. So this would have been masked if we hadn't looked both at age and race. And I think this is something that would be really interesting to keep in mind as you crunch through the data once it's collected.
And just to interrupt here. Ooh, go ahead, Evan.
Sorry, I just want to say really quickly that that's a great example of something that's actionable, because there's a consent decree monitoring team that's looking to sort of reach more people. They can look at this data and say, this is the groups we need to target, this is the age, this is the neighborhoods. I mean, it's all right there. So it's a good example of that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say exactly that. Go ahead, Eri.
Well, so if you go to the next slide, please. So one other example of what we did to compare across multiple questions, and this was a question on children and youth support. And as Evan mentioned, I think about half of the respondents were likely to select youth programs as their top budget priority, more than police and more than health. And then so we wanted to really understand, did the people who chose youth programs as the #1 priority prioritize within youth programs different things compared to everybody else who didn't choose youth programs? So what you see here is that to the question of if more money were allocated to children and youth support, within that, what should the government spend it on? Is it rec centers? Is it mental health for youth? And we compared the responses based on people who chose youth programs as their #1 priority versus other people. And we found that the people who chose youth programs as the #1 priority were more likely to choose rec centers compared to people who chose something else. So that's something that when we really wanted to dive into, well, of the people who care about youth and children, what are their priorities within that, the options available. So we also recommend comparing across multiple questions as you analyze the data. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it back over to Evan.
Yeah, I actually just want, this is good. I just posted a link in the chat, which is actually kind of relevant here, because you see the top right of the screen about organizing Black using data as part of the demand that 50% of the budget be invested in Black communities. We actually, coordinated, talked to Trey and talked to Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's also, focused on segregation in Baltimore. And when there was this whole conversation about defunding the police, we said, well, let's look at the blueprint data and compare what the people's priorities are with what the city's budget is. And if you click on that link, you can see we have those graphs sort of side by side, and it's incredibly stark. Money for hiring more officers, I think, is the 4th or 5th highest option. Youth programs is #1. The one you all picked, investing in communities, investing in neighborhood development, I think is tied for #2. But if you look at the city's budget, of course, police is the #1 budget item by a huge factor. So that's just an example of the kind of organizing that I think we're starting to do. I think it's still new, and it was interesting to see, that conversation point come up in organizing Black's advocacy. And Trey, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that or how you might use it going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be very brief. That definitely, to Evan's point, we were able to quickly connect the blueprint for Baltimore project to our broader demand around defunding the police. And particularly moving forward, one of the things that we're going to be focused on is when we talk about defunding the police, we are also talking about where we're shifting those resources to, right? And so when we look at the blueprint for Baltimore, when it came to the safety question, and I can't remember which question it was, but when it came to the safety question, the results showed that safe streets was this sort of choice for dealing with violence, right? And so what that taught us was that even when it comes to direct questions that relate to public safety that relate to policing, people do not want to see an increase in police. They want to see an increase in programs that address and creates this whole wraparound service that address violence, right? So that's just a snippet of how we're going to use the data moving forward to talk about how do we implement programs like that and get those things funded as opposed to police.
Yeah, and actually that other graph you mentioned is in that same link in the chat where it says, it asks people, how do you want the city to spend its money to respond to violence? And the top answer was give more money to the Safe Streets program, a community-based anti-violence program. Hire more officers, that was also an option. I think that finished 4th. So it clearly shows where people, what people want. So just really quickly, these other couple things, we did publish the data on this public portal with Seema's going to show us in a second. I hope we have enough time to get through it. And then we're looking about having more forums with city council members because we really want to, we actually had a conversation yesterday with a few of the city council members who have really latched on to the data because sometimes they are looking for ways to really dig into what people want. And frankly, some of these things are in their agenda anyway, so they can say, here's data that shows why this is my priority. So it actually bolsters their, their efforts at being community-based. So I'm gonna go to the next one. Great, data portal. Seema, this is you.
This is awesome. So, yeah, so, when we were approached to help the team think through how to make the data available to the public, that's exactly the kind of stuff that really jazzes us up at the university, at the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, because we want it to be that the data is in the hands of people. So this is actually our first project where we've taken a survey-based data and actually put it up on our open data portal. Most of our other data is agency-based and city-based. So if you go to our main website, which is bniajfi.org, and we can put that in the chat, and you go to our open data portal, that's where you'll find this project and the open data associated with this project. We actually have lots of projects. This is one of them. There's a whole coronavirus open data portal that we did a demo on Monday. But obviously I'm going to stick to this one today. If you click on the blueprint for Baltimore, you will get this dedicated open data portal, which I will also put in the chat for everybody to play around with. And to answer that question of, well, so not only by age and by race, but in Baltimore, it's going to matter what neighborhood you're in to understand what people's priorities are, because the nature of the neighborhood and the nature of the neighborhood context really does inform what people care about. So when you come to the open data portal, what you'll find is 3 ways to get access to the data. The simplest way is if you want to see the survey itself. This is a PDF right here on the right side. If you want to actually download and filter the data yourself and make your own histograms and charts, you can actually look at the raw survey data. It's de-identified. You cannot tell who did it, but you can have access to the raw data yourself, which we might have folks in the audience that will do this after today. But for most of you, you probably want to know, well, what was the difference in my neighborhood? So that's this first one where maps by survey responses. And I'm going to just quickly go through 1 or 2 of the questions. But about 10 of the questions were mappable at the neighborhood level. You can see what the actual report came in. That's the first thing you're going to see when you come in. So you can see what the overall responses were, just as a point of reference. But then you can come in and basically look at every question that has a neighborhood response. So in general, this is how you're going to look at any one of these questions. So currently, I think my neighborhood is a great place to live. And even though citywide it was 70%, you can see that there was a lot of variation by people, by neighborhood, of what people thought about whether or not their community was a great place to live. So you want to open up this legend so you can see what these colors mean. And so obviously the darker the color, the more percentage of the population in that neighborhood responded that they thought that their neighborhood was currently a good place to live. And sadly, you can see kind of where we are as a city. Some of this, 18, 19% that say that it's a great place to live. No percentage points saying that it's a great place to live. That's a kind of this idea of the tale of 2 cities. And why people comment certain opinions for different reasons. So that's an example of what's called a Likert scale, like from good to bad or low to high. But I did want to show you an example of questions that just had different responses. what did you say for some of the ones that we talked about before? So for example, let's use the thing that would make the most difference in my neighborhood. There were multiple responses, and overall, it was safer streets. The one that got the plurality of the respondents was safer streets, but you can see how different people responded to that with respect to safer streets. It's all over the place of who responded by neighborhood. Oops, I just zoomed in. But you can pick a neighborhood then and actually see, well, if they didn't say safer streets, what I think is interesting and something to think about is that McAlderry Park and Park Heights are where we have safe streets right now for a very long time. McAlderry Park actually has had safe streets for almost a decade. So if you see what they want to say now, what they want is a grocery store, they want more affordable housing. That's what they said was the most important thing. And maybe that's because they've had safe streets for such a long time that they don't need to make that their response now. So that's some ways to think about using this data for your own neighborhood and looking at how people responded to these questions, and then thinking about using this as a way to prioritize your neighborhood's next steps. Just quickly, since I did that very quickly, a couple things. There is a video on how to use the portal. So if you want to go back, it's about 5 minutes. If you want to take this to your own neighborhood and show others in your neighborhood how to use it, the video is a good way to do it. Obviously, what I just did is going to be recorded if you want to use that in the future.
Excellent. Excellent, Seema, thank you. And I really do hope we can have more opportunities to share this data because it's so rich, and have people really dive in and identify work that they can do based on it. I wanted to make sure we get to at least one or two questions. Amanda asked a really good question. She's working on a survey now, sort of in the COVID era. And I wondered if anybody, and Trey, I'm looking at you as an organizer also operating in the COVID era, have thoughts about how to engage with communities and folks, whether it's for surveys or just more broadly with the current situation.
Yeah, definitely. So first and foremost, thanks, Amanda, for that question, because I think it speaks to the need around what we're talking about currently in the movement, which is the digital sort of organizing era, right? So I have a couple sort of suggestions that you could take. One suggestion is definitely if you have the ability to do online data polling. Everybody at this stage is paying attention to a smartphone or a computer because that's the way in which we're connecting at this stage. And so that's sort of just like one avenue that you can always go, which is to figure out what are the sites that people are congregating on, the social media platforms, what are the groups that your target area is in, and being able to ask folks to keep that, to take the survey inside of those platforms, inside of those groups. The second, really quickly, the second way also is, although we're still doing socially distanced, there is a creative way that many folks, well, not many folks have done it, but that I've been encouraging folks to do around data collection, which is if you have the ability to canvass a neighborhood and put a clipboard on the porch and knock on the door and walk away and back up and be able to figure out a way to do that communication from 6 feet and talk to folks and explain to who you are. If you have a little piece of sort of pamphlet of information of what the survey is, and you can say, I'll be back around tomorrow to pick up this survey, that is essentially a way too that folks have begun to use socially distanced canvassing to say, okay, we can't be right next to you trying to get you to fill out this survey, but we can be creative around still canvassing, leaving the clipboard, giving the same information, backing up, and then coming back and get it when you're out of the vicinity or when you're out of the space. So that is something that is currently being tested out amongst a couple of places. And then mass actions. People are on the streets right now. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that there is a global uprising happening right now, right? And so to the extent that you can keep safe with your PPE and maybe even still ask people to sign a survey or two at a mass action, that is also something that I would encourage to do safely.
Excellent. So I think we're pretty much at time. Another thing I just want to say that Organizing Black has done, which is awesome, is started communicating by text as far as getting people engaged in their work, which is really innovative and really a good way to organize, you know, this in a good distance way. And it seems like everything else got answered. I think Seema sort of answered Darian's question about the historical data. don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
So the question was, there's no historical data for this survey, right? The survey happened at one point in time. Maybe we'll do it again in a few years. But this idea of knowing about a neighborhood, that just requires going into neighborhoods, right? And getting to meet people and you know, just to plug that the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance is celebrating our 20th anniversary. So we have 20 years of going into every neighborhood in the city of Baltimore. And so we're really happy that we were invited to be a part of this process and think through, like, how do we use this information to really understand how neighborhoods can use it. So we're excited to be able to host this portal, and it was a good experience for us too.
Excellent. And we are thinking about doing this survey again, certainly in 2 or 4 years, and maybe in some way even sooner. So we would really encourage any feedback. I think our emails are included in the presentation. So thank you everyone for joining. Is there anything else?
There's a survey for you to fill out, hopefully, to help us evaluate this. Thanks so much. It's in the link is in the chat. And I want to thank all of you panelists, Trey, Evan, Jose, Eri. This is the 15th out of 20th sessions for this whole week. It's been amazing. Keeps getting better. We have one more tonight. We have a mapathon at 7 o'clock that Cheryl's going to be leading. So if you want to kind of grab a drink and stay up late and join us for that mapathon, that would be awesome. And then we actually have Danielle Terrain speaking about how foundations in general use data to try and reduce, you know, racial inequality through their grant making tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. So I highly recommend joining us for that session too.
Yeah.
And thank you all very much for making this such a great session and part of a great week.
Thanks, everybody.